Today on the show, I'm chatting with Ed Comber from Next Stage Preservation. At Next Stage Preservation, they're working to bring Marceline, Missouri's Uptown Theatre back to life. Marceline, Missouri is, of course, the boyhood hometown of Walt Disney, and the Uptown Theatre is a cinema on Marceline's Main Street where Walt and Roy premiered The Great Locomotive Chase. The Uptown Theatre has a long history, but sadly, in recent years it has fallen into disrepair. A lot of money and work will need to go into bringing it back to life, and Ed is working hard to make that a reality. He's already had some success getting the Uptown Theatre on the National Register of Historic Places, which is no small feat. Listen as Ed and I discuss the theater's history, the small town of Marceline, Missouri, and what Ed envisions for the reopening of the theater during its 100th anniversary.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Ed, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. How you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you because this is really one of those subject matters that's just close to my heart. We're talking about theater preservation, and specifically the Uptown Theatre in Marceline, Missouri. Before we jump into all that history and what you're trying to do with the Uptown Theatre, and of course, I'm sure listeners, you hear Marceline, Missouri, you know, that's where Walt grew up. But you are the CEO of Next Stage Preservation. And let's just begin with, can you tell me a bit about Next Stage Preservation?
Absolutely. Next Stage Preservation is a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit that's dedicated to preserving our entertainment history, specifically with theaters in rural communities like Marceline. There are a number of these places that were cultural hubs, community hubs where there are first dates, first kisses, first jobs. And by opening these buildings again, not only are we preserving the history of that building, but we're preserving the history of those memories. Plus, by reopening, more jobs come to these small communities that can really, really use some, even 2 jobs makes a world of difference in some communities. That's really what we're all about.
And I mean, you've got your Figment shirt on, your I think it's a Disney Channel hat, perhaps. You're clearly a Disney fan, so I assume that's what kind of brought your attention to the Uptown Theatre.
Yes. If you want the full story is that my family and I, about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, stayed in the Uptown Theatre when it was still able to have people guests, because it's kind of going downhill.
And when you say stayed, we should tell people there's 5 apartment units that can be rented out as short stays.
And those are on the 2nd and 3rd floor. They overlook Main Street, USA. And we stayed in the suite, the Walt Disney suite, and fell in love with it. My profession is history related. I have loved history of small towns, history of world history, and I'm a minor architecture file or whatever, and I appreciate old towns and the styles that they have with them. And I'm looking at this building going, man, this is really cool. And the owner gave us a little tour of the auditorium and the foyer concession area, and I was like, man, this is great. But it had started to fall into disrepair. A lot of it is because of COVID. COVID, as we know, shut down pretty much everything. And so he couldn't do the work on it. And what I appreciated about it was that there was this long history in there of Walt Disney, of the architecture that's unique, and of the memories. So I asked the owner if he'd ever considered putting it on the National Register of Historic Places. He said, hey, you want to do it? Go for it. We've tried, but you get lost in everything. And I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. About a year later, We got it on the National Register. It's the first place in town in Marceline that's on the National Register. And that's basically how it came to be that I'm now attempting to purchase it.
Now, where were you visiting Marceline from?
Indiana.
Okay, so you live in Indiana. You head to Marceline, Missouri to kind of go on this Disney deep dive sort of trip.
Kind of. We stayed first in Hannibal, Missouri, which is the hometown of Mark Twain. So then we did a day trip to Marceline because we're D23 members. We have annual passes and just, 3 trips to Disney World a year, I think. So, we had to see where the man grew up.
Beyond just Disney, how did this passion for theaters develop for you?
I have loved theater since seeing my first musical, really. The extravagance of it. The first musical I ever saw was when I was 12 at the Pantages Theatre in Toronto, Ontario. Phantom of the Opera became my favorite musical. And every time I had a chance to go into see it anywhere, I made sure that it was in a classical, an old, historic theater because I don't even know how to describe the architecture. When I see the proscenium arches, when I see the chandeliers, it's just something that takes me back to that memory of my very first musical in Toronto. And that's just stayed with me the whole entire time. And I've loved theater. I write scripts. I have started trying my hand at a horror script that is set in a small historic theater. So I don't know. It's just, it all comes down back to that one time in this majestic old theater in Toronto.
I love that. And so that has inspired you to start Next Stage Preservation. Now, is the Uptown Theatre one of your earliest projects with Next Stage, or have there been some theaters you've already revived?
It'll be the very first project.
It'll be the first project. Okay, cool. Yep. So you said you stayed in the apartments at the Uptown Theatre just a couple of years ago. So is that,
yes.
2 years ago is like 2022. So you're saying you stayed in it post-COVID?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. At that point, was it just the apartments that were open? Like they weren't using the theater, right?
Correct. The images, the pictures I sent you, those are from our first trip. Most of them are from our first trip. A few of them are from later times where I needed to get pictures for the National Register nomination. So it hasn't been in good shape since our stay.
Yeah, because I was inside the theater in 2006 and it was being used as a venue. And listen, it needed some work, but it certainly wasn't in the shape of the photos that you showed me. That was honestly like shocking and heartbreaking to see those photos. When I went, it was the 2006 Toon Fest celebration. Have you heard about this? Yeah.
Yes.
I was actually moving across the country. I was driving across the country from Massachusetts to California, and I timed the drive around the Toon Fest celebration, went there, met Pete Docter when all he had directed at that point was Monsters, Inc. He didn't go on, he certainly wasn't running Pixar at that point. And it was such a fun little city, or town, I should say. But can you paint the picture of Marceline, Missouri for the listeners?
Marceline didn't exist on any map until 1888. The Santa Fe, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad literally stuck a pin in a map and said, hey, we need a subdivision here. So they stopped there and Marceline boomed right around it. Started up in 1888. I think it's within 6 months of the announcement that Santa Fe was marking it as a subdivision. And it became a bustling town, growing up to about 3,000 people at one point. It had multiple coal mines operating at the same time. When Walt was there, in that roughly 6 year period, the coal mines were booming. And so everybody had come in. So many people had come in. At that time, the entertainment was taking off too. They had brand spanking new opera house. They had all sorts of entertainment coming in, and By the time Walt left in 1911, they had Nickelodeons coming in. They had, I think that's about the time that they reached their peak. And then I guess the rest is kind of normal, I believe. The city went through ups and downs, just like everybody else during the Great Depression, and they're still standing today.
Yeah, and of course, Main Street USA at Disneyland was very much inspired by Main Street at Marceline. There's a ton of Disney history there. There's a ton of Disney stuff to do there, from the Walt Disney, not the Family Museum, that's San Francisco. What do they call it? The Walt Disney Hometown Museum?
Childhood hometown, yes. Yep. And then the old place where the Dreaming Tree originally was, there's I think they call it the son of the Dreaming Tree now. You can see the location of where the barn was on the Disney property.
Did you sign inside it?
Twice. I shouldn't have. I haven't, but I've done it twice, yes.
My signature's in there somewhere as well. So
I know
yeah.
it gets lost. It's especially lost now, I'm sure, because last year was the D23 event in Marceline, and we had, I don't know how many people came, but enough that I'm pretty sure our signatures are probably way in the background somewhere. I don't know how anybody found space in there to write on it, but it was a heck of an event too. But yeah, if I can, I'd like to go back to the Toon Fest that you're talking about.
Sure.
I showed you images, I think, of the Walt Disney Suite.
Mm-hmm.
Remember seeing those cartoons? That's from those. Those are some very famous cartoonists who drew on that wall. And it's another reason I really want to save this is because those are unique. Those are some of the first drawings from some of the greatest cartoonists we know.
Yeah, the Cartoonist Wall of Fame, and I saw Pete Docter's little drawing. I believe it was Mike Wazowski there, and I remember that. Like, I remember him signing the barn, and he was just hanging out outside the Uptown Theatre in a just very casual sort of setting, and it was a really, really fun celebration. I'm not sure if they're still doing it annually. Do you happen to know?
They aren't. I don't remember when it was stopped, but I think it stopped because of COVID. And then, things are starting to pick up, thankfully, in Marceline now. More people are coming in. They are working on, I think they're working on bringing back Toon Fest. I'm not entirely sure, though.
Yeah, I hope they do. It was a really fun event. And one thing, I think the best way to paint the picture of small town. I've never lived in a small town. I grew up in the suburbs, 20 minutes from Boston, and I've lived in Boston, but like small rural town, never lived there. And I'll never forget the day I pulled up to Marceline, Missouri, and this was like the day before the Toon Fest celebration. The street was quiet. It was pretty much dead. And I walked up to an ice cream shop, and there was a note on the door that said, "We're open. Just call if you want us to come down and make you some ice cream." And I was like, oh, wow. There's nobody working a storefront because there's so few people. They're just upstairs living life, and give us a call if you want some ice cream.
I grew up, better part of my youth was in a small town in northern Michigan that never even has hit a 1,000 mark in population. And that's exactly how it is. They, if you're not there, then just give us a call or buzz next door and say, "Hey, I want a burger." They'll come and make it. It's just the way it is in small town America. I absolutely love it. I grew up in Detroit and in northern Michigan, and the difference. So I can see where the culture shockish would be for you, because being in Detroit, it's not nearly as big as Boston or New York or any place else, but it's still that city atmosphere. And when we would go up north, it would still be, even though I was used to it, it'd be kind of a culture shock going, wait a minute, I have to call such and such to get an ice cream? Okay. But yeah, Marceline has that wonderful small town feel. And as we all know, Walt used that as the initial template for Main Street USA at Magic Kingdom. Disneyland Main Street could have looked differently had it not been for some other suggestions that were made. But when you look down, last time I was in Disneyland was last October, and it was amazing to me where I could go, oh, that's such and such, that's that, all right, and I could actually imagine how downtown Marceline was kind of straightened out to see almost everything. If you move, you're familiar with the park, right? With Ripley Park,
Mm-hmm.
by the museum. So if you turn that to the north, if you just move it, you're kind of walking into, because you would be moving the original train station, the one that Walt came through, not the one that's the museum now. You would be coming through that train station into that little open area and looking straight down Main Street. And if you look at it like that, where it's just a straightened version, you can still see Marceline's influence. It always seems incredible to me that he was there for about 6 years and it made that big of an impression on him that he said, you know what, I want my main area to look like this.
Yeah, agreed. It clearly made a huge impression. I remember one of the things that kind of shocked me and I was delighted by when I got there. And from what I understand, this isn't something that was added later. This was something that's been there for many, many years. Is on the side of a brick wall at the end of the street, there's like an old Coca-Cola advertisement painted on the wall, just as in Disneyland, you have, the Coke corner at as you exit the park. I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't know if that was a direct influence, but it's kind of a crazy coincidence if it's not.
I think it is, because if you look at Coke Corner, that's on the Zerker building. And Mr. Zerker was the official timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. And that part of the building was an addition. And they didn't even realize it was there until part of the addition burnt down and uncovered it. And so it turns out, I believe, that actual ad was there right around the same time. I don't think there's any real date on it, but it's so old. We know when the additions were put on. And so there is a very good possibility that Coke wall was visible to Walt. But the Zerker building itself, when you look at Coke Corner, you can see how it looks almost identical to the way the Zerker building sits on that corner.
Yeah, it's really crazy, some of the stuff that's there. Highly recommend. If you're ever near Marceline, Missouri, definitely go visit it if you're a Disney fan. Now, the theater opened on June 30th, 1930, but at the time it opened as the Dickinson Theater. It became the Uptown Theatre in 1936. So what's interesting to me with this is that the Uptown Theatre really did not exist while Walt was there. Walt was there as a child from 1906 to about 1911. And so the theater didn't exist during that time, but it's a 286-seat theater with 5 apartments and a couple of storefronts. Now, you mentioned you stayed in the apartments a couple of years ago. Are those still open, or is the whole building kind of unsafe at this point?
I'm not entirely sure if he still has them open. I don't believe that he has them open anymore.
I know a lot of people will look at Main Street USA and say, oh, there's the Main Street Cinema. The Uptown Theater must have inspired that. Well, not necessarily, because it wasn't there when Walt was growing up, and the premiere that he had there, which we'll talk about later, happened after Disneyland. So let's just talk a little bit about the history of the theater to start.
Sure. I'm going to start a little bit before that, because I think it crosses over with Walt's love for entertainment. Walt saw his first play in Marceline, Peter Pan, and he later played as Peter Pan. Now, what I've been told by the museum is that he saw his first film in a tent right behind a building that's across the street from the Uptown. And there was a Nickelodeon 2 doors down from the Uptown Theater that he could very well have been to. It really shows that he was influenced entertainment-wise by this town too. Now, the Uptown Theatre was actually a Nickelodeon itself, and it was combined with a Kaiser Coke department store next to it. So A.B. Cantwell in 24 purchased the Snappy Nickelodeon, and then later bought the Kaiser Coke property right next to it. So when you're looking at the facade and you see the business on the north end and the business area on the south end, well, those two, the one on the left or the north was the Snappy Theater, and the one on the other side was the department store. All Cantwell did was, after purchasing that, knock down that center wall, and he dropped the second floor and added the third floor. When you go in there, when we get it all modeled up and everybody can stay in there and do a nice tour again, you'll see where the old joists are for the old property. Now, what Cantwell did was I think he was a visionary in many ways. In 1929, he started seeing that the talkies were becoming popular, and he said, "Okay, we're going to make this big 280 plus, maybe 300 seat theater and show talkies." And that's what he did. He leased it to the Dickinson Theater chain, which is a regional chain. The owners actually lived in Brookfield, Missouri, which is only 15 miles from Marceline, and they opened it up in Kansas City. I think that they were up to something like close to 100 theaters at one point, and it became the Dickinson until 1936, when something happened. I haven't been able to figure this out yet, but something happened between Cantwell and Dickinson, and Cantwell yanked the lease. Dickinson said fine and opened up the Chief Theater about 2 blocks north. Now, you've been to Marceline. Can you imagine 2 full movie theaters in that town at the same time? Well, they competed for about 6 years, I think. But the Uptown became the Uptown in 1936 as a result of Dickinson being forced out. And it's been that way ever since.
And Disney, Walt might not have been there during the time of the Uptown Theater, but he certainly came back. And they had a pretty grand welcoming for Walt and Roy.
Yes. They were there multiple times. Walt had sent camera crews there to get pictures of the layout from Main Street USA while they were doing the Disneyland prep. Then the city really threw its full weight behind the support of Walt. They had a dedication of the school in Walt's name. They dedicated a park on the south end of town as Walt Disney Municipal. Then later, much later on, they petitioned for Kansas Avenue, which is the main drag, to be renamed Main Street USA. This was a lot later on. But then they also petitioned for the post office to be named the Walt Disney Post Office. So they've really embraced their number one star in town. And it's great to see that entire history has been wonderful. I don't remember the exact number, but there's conflicting accounts of how many people were at the Great Locomotive Chase in 1956.
So yeah, that was the Midwest premiere. That
was the big gala. That was the real welcoming of Walt and Roy back home. Some reports say it was 5,000. Other reports I've seen said 20,000. I'm not sure it was really 20,000. I think that might have been a journalist taking
some hyperbole there.
Yeah. They were kind of, let's make it a lot more than it was, but it was at least 5,000. And that basically doubled the size of the town. The fun thing about that, at least from my perspective, because it's focused on the Uptown Theater, is that a lot of the kids that were brought in to sing the Mickey Mouse Club song, so MIC, they didn't even know the song. They had to be taught it in order to do this.
I think from what I understand or what I read is that the Mickey Mouse Club didn't air in Marceline, Missouri. Like, it just wasn't a market that picked it up.
it wouldn't surprise me because it's so small, and the whole area is extremely rural. So, you have small towns around. They're probably not going to pick it up, but it kind of surprised me that it wasn't known because of Walt's history in that town. But it's just a fun little piece of trivia. And it's like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, obviously, a lot of people in that town very much embrace the Walt Disney history there. Do you happen to know? So I'm asking this because I grew up near Salem, Massachusetts, and there are a good number of people who live in Salem that are like, I never want to talk about Halloween again. And like, I'm like, well, you picked a pretty bad place to live. But I'm curious, do you happen to know of any, or have you heard of anything where some Marceline folks, I mean, I'm sure there's one, but I'm just saying, do you know if there's a collective group that's just like, all right, already?
I don't know if it's a collective group, but I have heard plenty of rumblings about, it's another Disney thing. And I don't know how, it kind of puts me on the spot because I don't want to admit that there's that part of Marceline, but I can see why, after a while you go, okay, here we go with another Marceline connection to Walt Disney event. But at the same time, it's something to really embrace, I think.
Well, I mean, the reality is if you're living in Marceline, Missouri, that means you like the small town lifestyle, right? And, if 5 or 6 times a year, I don't even think it's necessarily that often, but if a couple times a year there's a big Disney event being thrown either by D23 or independently, I can see how you're like, I just want my small town living, but perhaps pick a different small town.
Oh, there are a lot of people who depend on the tourism in town, but there are. I've heard from a few people who have said, the museum prices us out. $300 ticket for the common or the average Marcelinian is a bit.
Wait a sec. What is $300?
Like a ticket to one of the events. I think the
the D23 sort of events.
Yeah,
gotcha.
The D23 event was something like $300.
When you said the museum, I thought you meant the local museum, and I was like, I was a few dollars when I went.
Sorry. Yeah, the museum itself is just a few dollars, but the D23 events, those types of things, when there's a fireworks show and food, those run a little bit high for the average person in town. And I think that's the number one complaint that I've heard. It's just, maybe lower it to $100 for locals or something like that and put out that goodwill.
Honestly, I think that's a super valid complaint. And I think that the locals should get some sort of, I don't want to say priority, but there should be something for them, I can totally see that. Because listen, even $300 for me, it's not exactly like absolutely, let's do it, sort of thing, especially since most of it is people coming in from out of town. So they're booking a flight or some sort of travel and stay. And so I get it. It's not an inexpensive visit by any means. So the first big thing, as you said, when Walt and Roy returned was the Great Locomotive Chase 1956. And then years later, long after Walt's passing, they had a Spirit of Mickey world premiere in 1998. And this was in conjunction with the Walt Disney Company, correct?
That's correct. A wonderful woman. I don't know if I can say her name, so I won't, but she helped get it all together, helped contact the Disney Company and contacted the owner at the time of the Uptown and said, hey, is there any premiere that you can do for us here? And Disney said, hey, you know what? We're about to release the Spirit of Mickey short. It's only about 16 minutes, but yeah, we can do the world premiere there. And the rest is history. So the Disney Corporation, D23 events, Disney still does a lot of good stuff with the city. They understand the importance of it. I would love to reopen it to a Disney premiere of some type, or even to recreate the 1956 event. And because it maintains that historic feel in that original Disney feel when you do something like that.
Yeah, my brain always goes here, and it's unfair to the Walt Disney Archives for me to always think this way because there's so many Disney history locations that I'm always just like, why doesn't the Walt Disney Archives buy it? And that's what I thought with the Uptown Theater. I'm just like, why doesn't the Walt Disney Archives buy it and fix it up and do their, because as you said, D23 comes and throws official events and makes a lot of money doing it. But I get it. They can't buy everything. So, it's left up to people like you and me and whomever.
Well, I think it's been overturned now, but it used to be a rule that film companies could not own their own theaters.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that was so back in the day, studios did own theaters. Still, I would be surprised if there wasn't a loophole where like D20 or just the Walt Disney Archives could own it or something like that. I'd be surprised.
I know that Disney owns El Capitan.
True.
In Hollywood, but I think that was like a grandfathering in or something like that.
Well, it was the Paramount Theater before that, I believe. So actually that theater, have you been to the El Capitan?
I have been by it. I have not been inside it.
It's beautiful inside, absolutely gorgeous and ornate. And one of the things that's really interesting about its history, and folks, if you ever go to the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood, right on Hollywood Boulevard, highly recommend going to I think it's on the second floor. They kind of have a wall laying out the history of the theater. And the crazy thing is it began as this beautiful ornate theater. And then I think it was Paramount Studios that took it over and literally covered all of that beautiful architecture with just very super linear and just modern kind of look. And then when Disney took it over, luckily Paramount didn't damage anything. They literally just covered it up. So it was kind of like peeling off, wallpaper, for lack of a better term. And this beautiful architecture was still behind it and needed to be cleaned up, of course. But it was... it's a gorgeous theater, highly recommended. And they actually give tours, which I don't think they advertise too much, but you can definitely get a guided tour. Speaking of the El Capitan's interior and everything, can you paint a picture of what the Uptown Theater looked like? Was it an ornate theater or was it just kind of a black box? What in its heyday, what was the Uptown Theater?
In its heyday, the Uptown Theater was one of the most majestic buildings in the city. Of course, you light up that neon sign and it's going to grab attention. And when you look at the old Dickinson marquee, it's all lit up too. And so the facade, when you look at it now, that's identical to what it was. And it looks kind of bare there. That's a subdued version of the Spanish Revival style, which came with the Santa Fe Railroad, because if you look at the Santa Fe Railroad, that type of Spanish architecture has shown up in every single place. And it had to kind of blend in a little bit with the surroundings. So when you look at the facade, you're not seeing what's majestic, but when you walk in, it is very different. The description of the opening day talks about the tiling on the floor, which is still original. It's 1930 tiling that you walk on when you walk in. It talks about the plaster, which is still original there. The sconces that you see that are kind of shell sconces in some of the pictures are, as far as we can tell, original. Cantwell didn't seem to really... He really wanted to make it look like an experience and like something that you would see in Kansas City or St. Louis. He had a beautiful proscenium arch installed. He had alcoves at the front and around to give it that sense of here's a balcony or here's a private box. So what he did was he used the space as much as he possibly could to make it look like a Rialto in Kansas City, or I know that's a hard reference for anybody to picture, but I would imagine the El Capitan is sort of like that inside, where it's this elegance, and for Cantwell it was a subtle elegance. An interesting thing was that they had quiet rooms in there. Those are, they were attached to the bathrooms, and you could take your child in there who was crying, and nobody could hear you.
I want that in movie theaters today. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
right? That's what I was
Please.
thinking too. I'm like, whoa, where are these now? So you take your kid in there, you're in the bathroom. In that limited space, there's only one toilet in both places. But you go in there, there's this little box where you can sit in there. I don't know the dimensions, but I would imagine you could fit 2 or 3 people in there with their children. And you could watch. Nobody could hear you. You could hear the movie. It was apparently piped in on the sides. And like I said, Cantwell seemed to think of everything to make it this place where it was community. You felt like you were in a big theater when you were really in a small town like Marceline. And if you look at some of the pictures, you can still see those sconces. You can still see that proscenium arch. You can still see those alcoves that I talked about that are at the very front of right next to the stage on either side. There were changes later on, obviously, but when you walk in, you can still see a lot of the original and get a sense of what Cantwell was going for when he opened it.
I genuinely want quiet boxes for cell phone users in movie theaters. I want cell phone boxes.
Yeah,
That's what I want. Oh my
that would be
gosh.
great. I've always thought that, there should be a cell phone box. So as soon as you walk into the theater, you have to drop it into this box and you get a key so you can open it up. Because I don't know how many times we were at Inside Out 2 at the AMC in Disney Springs, and a couple of people were on their phones during it. I'm like, here I am almost in tears watching this, and I have glaring at the same time. I'm like, no, that was an incredible movie. To digress a little bit here.
So that's a picture of what the theater was like in its heyday. Let's do the hard conversation and talk about its current state.
Oh, that is the hard conversation. The plaster is starting to fall off in a number of places. The ceiling, particularly over the auditorium, let's start with that part. That's the most important thing. The ceiling in the auditorium is just in really bad shape. The ceiling tiles are all gone. And there is a chunk, it's not a view, you can't see it in any of the pictures that I had, but there is a chunk that fell out of one of I think it was the arch itself. Part of it fell out because of the water coming through the roof. You look at the pictures and you can see where the stage that Walt stood on in 1956, and pointing up toward the clock, is covered with a tarp. Now, there's one picture that I sent you. If you look all the way over to the left side, you can see where some of it hurts when I say it. Some of the seats are fallen in to the floor, that the floor is caved in. And that's just in the auditorium. Seats caving in, the floor caving in, the ceiling, the roof leaking so bad that things are starting to fall apart. That's the hard part. But when you go into the apartments, you can see some leaks coming through there. It's gotten to the point of being very mildew smelling. Most likely there's mold in the walls as well. There are a couple of vloggers out there that I gave tours to at the D23 event last year. A number of them are on social media. Cole that's Bibbidi Bobbidi Beard on Instagram, the Dapper Danielle, and a few others that I gave tours to, plus Nate from Paging Mr. Morrow and Sean Kloss from the Kingdom Crew. All were given a tour as much as I could because I couldn't get them into the auditorium because it was in such bad shape. All have done something to show the inside.
So what is going on? I don't want to point fingers at the current owner, but what is happening? I understand there's not the money to fix it, but what is being done just to make it not get worse?
He is working on patching up the roof. But the problem is that it's a flat roof, and if you've ever lived someplace with a flat roof, they just don't agree with you all the time. You can tar and the entire thing, and somehow water will get in. What it needs is a complete rip-off and a completely new one, and that's going to run $150,000 at a minimum to really make it so it's quality work. And that's what's happened is COVID made it so much worse that it made it almost impossible to keep up with the needs. The 2.5 or so years that it had to be shut down, and now it's in that shape where you can't. And I know you don't want to point fingers, and it's hard not to. But when it gets to that point, it's usually, in my opinion, and you can't quite keep it up, it's time to let somebody else see what they can do. And that's a big part of why I want to do this, because I have such an intimate connection with this building. I understand, too, that it's a huge project, but letting the roof go and not finding that extra money really has been the downfall for that theater.
I mean, and to be fair, I mean, theaters, we're always hearing about, especially small independent theaters. Listen, I'm a moviegoer. I'm an AMC A-list member. I use that A-list and I go to the multiplex. I literally have 3 of them within walking distance down the street from me. So I get it. There's like that ease and desire and just it's cost savings to go to the mainstream theaters sometimes. But I have a great love and deep appreciation for these small independently run theaters. And I mean, I've told you, I was working closely with the Friends of the Rialto in South Pasadena, California, trying to save that theater. And it's a tough fight. It's a really, really, really tough battle and a long road. And I appreciate that what you're trying to do there. Let's talk about one of the successes you've already had. You mentioned it earlier. You did get the building on the National Register of Historic Places. So I'd love to hear about that process, what it was like to do that, and also what does that mean exactly for the theater?
And the National Register of Historic Places is a list of every historic place in the United States. And the process is long. It depends on how much detail you have to put in to a nomination. Determines how long it takes to get it on. I'm working on one that's taken nearly 2 years right now because of all the intricate details, and we need to get every single thing right. It took roughly a year. What I had to do was I had to research the architecture style. I had to show why that architectural style is unique in Marceline. I had to then go and take copious pictures of the inside, explain what was original, what might still be historic but not original, any changes that we could track. So, for example, when it was switched from the Dickinson to the Uptown, it was a new owner. The new owner made some changes. And I had to go through newspaper accounts and any records of building records to see if I could determine what was changed. You're not expected to get every single change because some just aren't mentioned. But throughout the process, it takes a lot of time to really get every single detail of just the facade described and any other exposed walls. And then inside, you have to talk about the sconces. You have to talk about wainscoting. You have to talk about the stage and describe it in as deep a detail as you possibly can. What you're trying to do is you're trying to paint a picture of what it used to look like versus what it looks like now and what role it played in the history of that region or that area. And in the National Register requires so much detail that I think it took me probably about 200 hours of work at least. And I've lost count as to how many times I went back to Marceline to get pictures, to talk to the owner, to talk to other people, to look through the physical copies of the Marceline newspapers that the library has, just to get that full of view and understanding of what the theater is and was. Now, why is it good to be in the National Register? Now, first and foremost, who doesn't want to say, look, I own a historical property? It's recognized by the federal government. There's a lot of confusion about what that means. Some people think, well, if it's on a National Register, I can't do anything with my building, which is an absolute misrepresentation of what reality is. Owners can still do whatever they want with it. The National Register is there just to record that this building was here and it looked like this and this is what happened and this is why it was relevant. If an owner wants to destroy it, well, they can. Nobody's going to stop them. But the benefit, other than kind of, look, I have something that the federal government says is important to history, is that it opens up federal and state grant money. So a private owner can get it on. It doesn't have to be a nonprofit like I have or that owns it right now. It can be a private owner for profit if they want, and they can apply for federal grants, state grants, things like that. They can partner with somebody to get funding, which is what we're trying to do, and use that money to keep it up, to remodel it, to bring it back to life. And that's pretty much the National Register in a nutshell.
Now, I assume you have to submit photos of what it looks like today. I don't pretend to understand the process, and maybe you don't know it this deep either, but whoever's making those decisions of whether or not it becomes a part of the registry, do you know if they'll look at current photos and in some cases just be like, whoa, that is so far gone that we're not even going to put it on the list, or is that not part of the consideration?
I don't know. It varies by state. There's a standard that all state historic preservation offices are supposed to follow, but they leave a lot of latitude for interpretation. And I didn't have that problem with Missouri. The council that is appointed by the governor in Missouri, ACHP, Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, was very open, and they loved the presentation and they loved the nomination itself. And I think that this would be probably something that's across all 50 states, is that they don't really consider the current condition as much as one would be tempted to do. Like, if I looked at it going, man, this is rough, I don't know, that would be my first reaction. But they have a standard where it has to be, still has to have the look and the feel of the way it was. So even if, the roof was missing, you could still get a sense of the place that the Uptown is and was. And they would apply. I think that they would consider that when they make any decision.
Now, I know your dream is to really open it for the 100th anniversary, which brings us to the year 2030. So let's just think positive for a second. Let's think we get there. We get to 2030. We're reopening. What does reopening day look like for you? What is the dream scenario?
1956. It looks like a whole bunch of kids singing Mickey Mouse, the Mickey Mouse Club song. It is Walt and Roy impersonators coming in. That impersonator standing on that stage. It is the entire city coming together and seeing that sign lit up saying Uptown. It is a huge gala, and I would love to be able to partner with D23 on that opening. I think that with their support, we could just get, we could do the doubling or even quadrupling, hopefully, of the population on just that day. That day would also include a showing of the Great Locomotive Chase. After that, I would probably go into, with Disney's permission, of course, showing other Disney movies, particularly doing the Spirit of Mickey right after the Locomotive Chase. So, we get that whole, here's what's come to Marceline. We're going to show you that. This is how it used to be, to the best of our ability, of course.
Very cool. And I know, currently you have an Indiegogo campaign raising funds. It sounds like you're looking for, large companies perhaps to get involved as well, with the goal of buying the theater. So when you say buy the theater, do you mean your organization buys the theater? You buy the theater? Are you moving to Marceline? What does that mean?
That means that our organization will be purchasing it. We'll be owning it as a nonprofit, not me personally. I have no personal interest in trying to run a theater itself. The organization, once we have it and it's up and running, would be hiring a caretaker, a manager for it. I do have a number of people that I know in Hollywood who would love to run an historic one theater, so I would be calling on them to say, hey, this is your expertise. You handle it. Next stage is going to move on to the next rural cinema. We have our eyes on one in Pittsfield, Illinois. It's a small Art Deco one, and it's owned by a nonprofit, and it's on the National Register too, but they're struggling with finding funds. We would use the funds from Uptown to help other theaters, like the one in Pittsfield. So that's our big plan, is the Uptown will bring back part of all sorts of history, First Dates, et cetera, like I said, plus Disney, and open it to festivals, open it for film showings. There's a lot of kids who do films nowadays, and they put it up on YouTube, but wouldn't it be cool if they could put it up on a big screen and say, hey, look, I just had my own premiere in Marceline on this small screen. So that's what the whole idea for Next Stage is to bring these back, let the community basically come in and help support it. And then we move on to helping the next one. We will maintain the Uptown under our ownership, but that's what we want to do, is we want to bring in the community to do what they can do and maintain it from there.
Have you reached out to the Walt Disney Archives at all about this specific project?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
We are still considering that. We have been reaching out to others that are film-based, that have theater interest, to see what their interests are, because it's not just Walt Disney. It has that long history of showing a lot of classic movies, many of them that don't exist anymore, that have been destroyed from, because of age and because of censors, censored right out and can't see them anymore. So we've reached out to film historians, and those types of individuals were kind of working up on a scale and going up to eventually D23.
Very cool. Now, how do folks keep informed about what's going on? Is there a website? Is there a newsletter? Is there a Facebook group?
There is, right now, we have X, Twitter, whatever we call it now, and Instagram, where I post about updates and a lot of Disney stuff too. And if you sign up for our campaign, you'll get updates through that about what's happening. And then we have a website. It's nextstagepreservation.org, and we will be starting a newsletter on that site. So in the next week or so, there will be a joiner newsletter, which will give you updates on this project and anything else that we're doing.
Excellent. And what is the username on Instagram and Twitter you mentioned?
On X, it is Next Stage FNDTN, and on Instagram, it is Next Stage Preservation.
Very cool. Excellent. And of course, I'll be sure to include those links in the show notes, folks. So check those out. Ed, I love what you're trying to do here. I wish it nothing but the best, and I thank you for taking the time to chat about it.
I appreciate you taking the time to have me on, Jeff. I thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Dizney with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. This episode has been executive produced by Jeffrey Riccio. Gain rewards like Jeffrey, including access to never-before-heard episodes and live-stream Ask Me Anythings, by visiting the Patreon link in this episode's description. And thanks to Ode to My Berries for leaving a 5-star rating and review saying, "So good, love these guys, they totally give me my Diz fix." Leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, and you may just hear it read on a future episode. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description, from additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!